Welcome, Reverend Scott Spencer. Can you introduce yourself and the community that you come from?
Sure. I'm Reverend Scott Spencer. I'm the lead pastor of Mosaic Community Church here in Oklahoma City.
Well, great. Thank you for being here. And you just returned a few weeks ago from Minneapolis as
Yes.
part of the clergy call. Can you talk a little bit about what was that clergy call? What was the call for? How did that come about? And what did you do while you were there? What were you asked to do when you were there?
Sure. I saw on social media that there was this event happening in Minneapolis. It was going to be happening, I believe, on January the 22nd. And I saw this about a week, really just a week before the event. And I didn't recognize really the organization or the people that were behind this, but I had this sense that it was a local organization in Minneapolis, or it has Minnesota ties, and it was a call to faith leaders from across the nation to come to Minneapolis and to be in support with those who were working on issues of immigration and the current situation happening in Minneapolis with ICE. It was framed in the sense of Martin Luther King had invited, clergy and faith leaders to come to Selma, and they were now inviting clergy leaders and faith leaders to come to Minneapolis. I soon learned that the organization that issued this call was known as March, Multi-Faith, Anti-Racism, Change and Healing, and that organization had essentially been working together. Various organizations and had been working together for 3 decades on issues there in Minneapolis or Minnesota, or even nationwide issues that affected them locally. And so this group amazingly pulled this event together in about 8 days. Eventually, there were 17 faith leaders from across Oklahoma that
Oh,
we're
okay.
aware of that made it to Minneapolis. We didn't all get there together, but we did all see each other there in Minneapolis, and we represented various faith traditions, and some of us we were mainly from Tulsa and Oklahoma City. That was the primary areas that people were from. And when we got there, there were approximately 600 other faith leaders that were able to get into the event on Thursday. They had limited space, of course, but many people showed up without having been received a affirmation from the. Many people registered but didn't get the. They were told the event was full, but people felt so strongly about it they came anyway. So the organization actually pulled together a second venue and had other kinds of learning and information sessions for those who didn't get into the main gathering. When we got there, there were just several. I think that most people may be aware that on the 23rd, which was a Friday, was sort of a statewide for Minnesota day of action around ICE and immigration. There were some demands being made by the organizations there in Minnesota. They wanted ICE to leave Minnesota immediately. They wanted the officer who had killed Renee Good to be held legally accountable for that. They did not want any more additional funding for ICE in the upcoming congressional budget. They also wanted ICE to be investigated for human and constitutional violations of both Americans and our neighbors. They also wanted Minnesota and also national companies to become Fourth Amendment businesses, to cease economic relations with ICE, to refuse ICE entry or using their property for staging grounds. Now, I have to admit, I understood that was the call, but I went primarily to listen and to learn, but also to engage in acts of witness when I felt appropriate to do that. I realized I didn't understand, all the issues, but I wanted to definitely listen, and that was part of the reason for going. We heard a lot of stories from people who live there and work there about what's going on, and I feel like I did learn a lot. There were lots of people from various organizations that sometimes it was sharing in a 30-minute segment, perhaps a 4-hour workshop. They'd be like, this is a 4-hour workshop we're putting into 30 minutes. So it felt almost like being in front of a fire hydrant that was just open, with the full 100% water coming at you. The amount of just information and stories, it was very impactful to be there. And the thing that struck me that first morning, and we were just there for a day actually, but that morning, they were just so grateful that we showed up. I think if the only thing that happened is that we had shown up to be supportive, that would have been enough, because I think they needed to feel like they weren't alone, and that Minneapolis wasn't alone, and that their work, they weren't doing it alone, and that we were there to support them. And the other issue was that we wanted to bring back home what we experienced there and learned there. The reality is that ICE is, all over the nation, and if ICE is doing something wrong, they need to be held accountable for that. So the idea was not that ICE just has free reign in our communities, but the idea was, what can we learn about what's happening in Minneapolis, and then bring that back to Oklahoma if or when needed. So,
and I have just heard a lot of people asking, I was just at a dinner the other night, and the question was, what's happening in Oklahoma, and how is that different than what's happening in Minnesota? We've been hearing, I think I've heard conflicting things, that you don't see a lot of the sort of more visible things happening in a place like Oklahoma, because there's more cooperation from authorities, and so it's happening, but it's just more, they're not fighting the resistance from like businesses or whatever. So it is happening here, but it's just quieter and less visible. But then I've also heard that maybe states like Minnesota are being specifically targeted for a larger presence. And then I've also heard that because of the resistance that they found there, that then they are going to move on to a heavier presence in states where they won't meet that kind of resistance. So I feel like I'm hearing a lot of different things. What do you feel like is the takeaway that you got?
I think before I went there, I was aware that there's a heavy presence in Minneapolis of ICE agents. And I did have the sense that perhaps Minneapolis was being targeted by the administration. One of the statistics we heard that morning was that there were 3,000 ICE agents in Minneapolis. But at that exact same time, there were 600 agents in Chicago. And if that was true, that's staggering. And so there's a reason why that there would be such an ICE presence in Minneapolis. Is the reason because there are that many more undocumented people that they feel like they need to be, I'm not for sure the right word to use. Are there that many more undocumented people in Minneapolis that are causing problems that ICE needs to engage with them, versus Chicago? Are there that fewer, undocumented people? And the question really is, who is ICE targeting? We have heard from the administration that the worst of undocumented people, and that's not necessarily the language of the administration. I mean, the worst of the worst is their language. I will use the terminology undocumented. The current administration may use other terminology, but we've heard that the worst of the worst is who's being targeted. And when I hear that, and I think we hear these things as well, but what I hear is, people who've murdered people who have raped people who've committed, horrible, terrible crimes. And what we're really finding among many people is that's not the case. We're hearing stories of people that are here and going through the process in a legal way, are being intercepted and being sent to these centers where they're being held, perhaps being deported. So if someone is showing up for if someone is showing up for a hearing in immigration, the immigration system, like we expect them to, but they're being intercepted, is that really that we're getting the worst of the worst? And that doesn't seem to be the case. So there's the question of who is ICE really targeting, and is it just? Is it fair? Is it right? Is it who we are as citizens of this nation? That's what we're doing. And so I went to hear their stories, and I think that I have been more aware of ICE activity in Oklahoma since I've come back. And I usually try to keep up with the news, but I don't know. Sometimes it's hard to know when you see things on social media. It's sometimes very hard to know, is this really true or not true? But the local media, did talk about ICE activity along I-40 or I-35. I do know that there was a business near Northwest 23rd Street and Penn and here in Oklahoma City where there was ICE activity in their parking lot. And the business actually issued a public statement about this, and issued a statement about the safety of not only their employees, but the safety of the people who come to their business. And so I think that there is ICE activity happening here. You are correct that some states are perhaps more cooperative with ICE, more sympathetic, perhaps to this administration. What I've also learned since I've come back is that local police or sheriffs, different policing organizations are in need of money. Many of them are underfunded, and they can partner with ICE through legal means to not only then cooperate with ICE, but receive some funding. And so it is, if you were in need of funding, it may be that you are partnering with ICE and assisting ICE, but it's also because you're receiving funding and you are underfunded. So the question might be, how do we properly fund the police or the sheriff or the jails? Right? If they're underfunded and need more funding, how do we properly fund them locally or statewide so they don't have to turn to, say, ICE to be funded? That's a great question. I don't have an easy answer for you at this moment, but that's something we could definitely explore and see what's going on there. So, but you're right. I think also Minneapolis would say to us, we hope that, and they didn't use the language if, they used the language when. So when this happens to your local, in your local locations, we want you to have this information and be better prepared. The question though also is Minneapolis a test case for ICE or for this administration, right? What can we get away with in Minneapolis that we could then get away with in other places? So that's something to consider.
Okay, and then what do you feel is like something that you did want to bring back to Oklahoma, or that you feel like we need to have more of, or a way that what does Oklahoma need to respond in a constructive way?
I think we definitely live in a very divided time, and I don't know, people always talk about we were more united in the past, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. We have to be really good students of history, right? We can look throughout history. People have always been divided, but we live in a very divisive age. I think that the 24-hour, 7 days a week news cycle contributes to a lot of our angst and a lot of our division in our world. And I think social media, and I love social media. As I get older, I feel like I know less and less about it. But I think social media in some ways, even though it can be used for good, it has contributed to anxiety and anger, and it's contributed a lot to division among our communities, and in our nation and in this world. And I just see that being played out every day. It's almost like you can't escape it. The Super Bowl becomes this super hot political, hot potato, right? It's just amazing how divided we are. And
well, I'm learning that I just started a podcast called Who Trolled Amber? And it's about the Heard v. Depp or Depp v. Heard trial that took place last year. But it's about basically how somebody, I haven't finished the podcast yet, so I don't want to speculate on who, was able to pay a lot of money to not only have bots spread a certain narrative about that case, but actually to pay real people to create accounts or able to create new accounts that are literally just created to produce content about, and that's TikTok videos. It's hashtags on Twitter. It was all videos, podcast, like it was all this new content that was being produced solely for like out of thin air to spread a certain narrative. And they really can link that to the outcome of that trial. Like they can directly show that because this narrative was spread so strongly, and even I didn't know anything about that case at all. And it seems random to be bringing up the Depp v. Heard trial, but it's really, they're using that as an example that's benign. But even I felt like I kind of was a little confused about that, what I was hearing about that trial. And then to come to find out that it was all generated by fake social media accounts that were bought by someone with a lot of money. And so then you can apply that to all this other, when I really am now trying to catch myself. When I become demoralized or discouraged by what I'm seeing online for reactions, comments, is that reality? And is that what I'm really seeing in real life? Is that what I'm really experiencing with the people who are around me that I actually engage with in Oklahoma every day?
Yeah, I think that social media changes so quickly that it's hard for us as people to keep up with how it's affecting us, right? We sort of get sucked into it, right? I mean, I feel like I was aware of TikTok, but I wasn't on TikTok. And then, clergy colleague kept talking about TikTok, and I finally, got on TikTok. But you just kind of get sucked in, and things change. Sometimes things change on social media without any warning, right? You wake up one morning and your whole Facebook experience is different, and you had no warning that it was going to be different, right? But the people who, TikTok, I think it's hard to keep up with who owns things and then how the rules change, right? And how they get your information, or they use your information, or I think all of us joke around now about anything I say out loud, social media is listening to me somewhere, right? And I think that we joke around about that, but I think it's partly true that we're not keeping up with really what's being, I hate to say it's being done to us, but it really is kind of being done to us.
Did you get a sense that there were things happening that maybe the rest of the country doesn't know about, or that's not being widely reported? Or
I think that happens a lot with any topic. And I also then began to Google local Minneapolis news sources. The hard part about that sometimes is sometimes you have to pay for that. And that becomes, a little bit problematic if you just don't have unlimited resources to keep paying for news stuff across the world, basically. But I was looking, how is this being reported locally? And what are we not hearing on the national news? Are you asking me, though, about the arrest specifically? Like, was that a thing, or was that known? Or
what were the details of that? I couldn't really get any information.
So I think I can safely say that there were many, many, many organizations working that week. I mean, that on the 23rd, that was a big day in Minnesota. I forget the exact name of that day. Like, they had a name for it. There was a lot of things planned. There were a lot of things happening. Like when we got into Minneapolis on Wednesday, there were we were aware of a lot of different things happening, but that wasn't all happening through the organization that we were with, of course. On Thursday afternoon, we did hear about that there was going to be this demonstration at the airport, and the reason for that was to basically hold accountable, or at least alert the airlines that are cooperating with ICE, or to alert the private airlines that are operating out of the airport that we don't like what you're doing. You're cooperating with ICE. And I think that what we heard was that there were 3 flights a day leaving the Minneapolis airport deporting people. And I am not prepared. I don't want to say names right now because I don't want to misname somebody, but one of these was a major airline, and then one was a private airline. I think at least 100 clergy were arrested that morning at the airport. So,
and they were arrested because they were on private property, or what was the charge?
I believe they were arrested because they were willing to stand in the way to perhaps shut down that part of the airport temporarily, right? It's one thing. There's all kinds. If you want to be involved in this kind of work, you can be involved in all kinds of ways. So you might be the person that wants to, write and call your legislators. You might be the person who wants to, behind the scenes, you're collecting data or information, right? Because you're not a public speaker, but maybe you are a public speaker, and then you want to come to a, rally and hold a sign at the, at the state capitol. But sometimes there may be a moment where you're called, or people are called to actually shut something down. So they wanted to temporarily shut down the airport, or at least part of the airport. And certainly when you do that, then you're breaking the law, and you're probably told, you can stand up and clear out right now, or if you continue to kneel here and block traffic, we're going to have to arrest you. So that's what that was about. And I think that's meant to bring attention to the matter. Mm-hmm. It is also meant as a wake-up call to the company that you are protesting against. So,
mm-hmm.
Sometimes
that people of faith have a moral imperative in this situation.
Right. And what role do the clergy and faith leaders play? Many people will say church should not be political, but I can only speak from the Christian tradition. To say that we can't be political is to say we would ignore our history. And I don't just mean our history, but I mean the history of the Bible itself, right? We have the prophets, we have Jesus, we have, so, and of course there's different ways to interpret all that, but you would have to be completely in denial to say that politics is not a part of what is meant to be a part of the church. And I don't believe Christians should solely be in charge and force their views on everyone else. That's not what I believe. But I do believe that we are called to be salt and light in the world, for example, and we're called to make a difference. And yes, if we see something that we think is immoral, wrong, we're called to stand up against that. And the question becomes, really, is what ICE is doing right? Is it moral? That's the question. And each one of us has to decide what we believe about that and what we're willing to do. Or do we want to sit back and just complain, or do we want to try to make a positive difference in the world? So at times we know people have been willing to risk their own lives for that which they believe in.
So is there, since you all have been back, have you been able to kind of put anything together in terms of organizing here in Oklahoma?
Yes, I've actually been amazed because in the past 2 weeks, many things have happened or are happening. One Several faith leaders have been communicating and meeting and to talk about this very issue, ICE and immigration. And there have been a couple of events that have already been held. Clergy and other faith leaders gathered to learn more about this, about how ICE can provide money to local law enforcement so that the local law enforcement would work alongside or help ICE. So we've learned the mechanics of that, why they're doing it, what is good or not good about that. But if someone's afraid to leave their home, um, are there ways we can get them food? What about medicine? What about that kind of stuff? And there are people in our community who are scared. There are people who are scared. And so probably every clergy knows people who are scared. Perhaps people aren't coming to church because they're scared. There's those conversations are happening.
You had mentioned to me earlier that, in Minneapolis, it felt like a lot of different various organizations from varying backgrounds had been working together for several years, and that they had a lot of trust and relationship built up over time. And do you feel like we can do that in Oklahoma?
I do feel like that. Thank you for bringing that up. But I do think that we should know our neighbors better, just at a very basic level.
Mm.
I'm not always good at that in terms of my neighbors. And I think as leaders, we should definitely, all of us have, that inward focus of our jobs, the organization we work with, whatever it is we're doing. But I think for the sake of our own humanity and for the sake of the future of this world, we have got to more and more reach out and to people who are both like-minded, but also not like-minded with us. We have got to learn from each other. We've got to understand each other. We have to build relationships. We have to see that perhaps people that we think are our enemy, maybe they're not our enemy, but it doesn't mean we agree with them 100%. And I just think that our world is becoming so polarized. And I think that the more work we can do about building positive relationships is so important. It is easy to live in our own little world and with our own people that we like and the people that are like us, that we just have to really expand our horizons. And so I think any work we can do with that, if you belong to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, if you could do something with a neighboring faith group, that is just so important. And there's organizations that do facilitate this in places like Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and it may be harder in smaller towns, but it's not impossible in other towns. Even doing things across denominations may be just a first step. I mean, in your town, the Baptists getting together with the Catholics, that may be revolutionary for your town, right? But I just think the more we can do, that it's going to be a better world we live in. And I would encourage that. And I think I came back from Minneapolis I've always been willing to do that. That's kind of who I am. That's my DNA. In more than one place I've lived, I've always reached out to people of other beliefs and worked. Early on in my ministry, we had a youth group that all the churches that wanted to participate did, because none of us could do it alone. It was a very small town. And I just think that that's what we need to be doing if we can. And so I would encourage that. So what I was going to say is that I have always been that way, but coming back from Minneapolis, I had a renewed commitment to that. And I realized my own local church has been dealing with some of its own internal things, with our own denomination, for example, that sometimes I use that as an excuse of like, I got to work on this and I can't work out in the community on this thing, And I think with COVID, we all, focused on ourselves and our own families and our own local groups that we were a part of. And it was easy to work with others kind of on the back burner. But I think now this is a wake-up call that we cannot just focus on ourselves. We've got to reach out and be there for each other. I just think that's the way that we're going to make the world a better place, I believe. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience and for going and being that witness and bringing